Cool.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the last episode of our African Startup Investment Summit in partnership with AfricArena and Founders Factory Africa. I am Eva Warigia, Ecosystem Manager at AfricArena. For the attendees that haven't been across our brand yet, AfricArena is an African tech accelerator specialized on open innovation challenges. We do the bridge between investors, entrepreneurs, and corporates that are operating in the African tech ecosystem. We recently released a report on the state of tech innovation in Africa that is accessible on the link that you see on the page. In this report, we unpack the investment trends, how to grow venture in Africa, explain the ins and the outs of corporate open innovation in Africa, and we gave our forecasts for the next years. Today's event would not be possible without our colleagues from Founders Factories Africa. That will be presented in a couple of minutes by Rajiv Daya, the head of investments. So to understand, the purpose of this series of 3 episodes is to address both the short-term capital constraint in the early stage African investment market, as well as the more general pause on investor engagement when it comes to investing into new companies. The goal of this series is also to present the long-term and sustainable intervention to stimulate African early-stage investing. For today, this session, named An Aligned Investment Process in Africa, introduces participants to the long-term and sustainable intervention to stimulate African early-stage investing. So today we have 3 amazing panelists that have participated to initiatives that aim to make the startup creation process, as well as the VC investment process, easier in the early stage investing environment. Following the panel discussion, we'll be hearing from 3 exciting startup founders who are rapidly adapting to current conditions and will pitch their businesses. But before jumping directly on the session, for the participants that couldn't attend our 2 previous episodes, 2 weeks ago, we had our first event named Developing a Resilient Startup Ecosystem, where in this episode, we discussed the current pain points in the African startup ecosystem. We talked about the measures that are working and the ones that are failing. We had highly qualified panelists who gave advice, feedback from their own experiences of finding bridge financing, extending runway, and they also talked about customer retention, traction, and also how they pivoted their businesses in times of crisis. In that first episode, we also put the spotlight on financing tools with experts debating the use of venture debt, crowdfunding as sources of capital in this current condition. And we wrapped up that first edition with an approach of some collaborative efforts to facilitate investment through shared resources and markets. Second event last week was about investing in early stage businesses during uncertain times. First part, we brought together fund managers and limited partners to discuss short-term measures that can be adopted to raise investment in Africa. They explained to us how funds continue to invest in these current conditions. And we finished that event with the second part where we heard from 3 innovative African startups founders who also rapidly adapt to the current conditions. So these 2 events are available in replay. So you can find them on YouTube and different platforms. And now I will hand over to Rajiv Daya, who will present the panelists and kick off with this session.
Thank you very much, Leo. And hello to everyone who's taken the time to join us today. Just like our co-hosts at AfricArena, we at Founders Factory Africa are really committed to catalyzing investment into early stage tech startups in Africa. And we've taken quite a unique approach at FFA and quite an operational approach to this by de-risking early stage investment through co-building. And as you can see on the slide, we're backed by Africa's largest corporates. We're Pan-African in our approach. We focus on tech-enabled startups, and we're part of a wider global Founders Factory family across the US, UK, and Europe. As you've heard from Leo, we have looked at issues that founders currently face. We've heard from VCs and LPs about how they're thinking about the future. And today we turn our attention to the bigger picture, because no matter how long isolation, travel restrictions, and limited use of our shoes goes on for, we still need to think about what our investment ecosystem needs in order to thrive over the long term. And helping us unpack some of these measures is a fantastic panel who invest in Africa, who engage with startups and with regulators on a daily basis. And so we're extremely privileged to be informed by their collective perspectives. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our panel, and I'm going to ask them to do two things as we kick off. Number one, to please introduce your respective initiatives and organizations. And second, to tell us your key non-work related takeaways from being in lockdown or isolation. So I'm going to start with Shelley Lotz, who joined SAVCA in 2016 as the head of regulatory affairs, focusing on engaging with regulators such as National Treasury, the South African Reserve Bank, South African Revenue Services, and Financial Sector Conduct Authority. Prior to this, Shelley's extensive experience in the financial services sector included 8 years at Horizon Equity Partners and time as a finance lead in the launch of the Royal Bank of Scotland's £1.1 billion private equity fund. Shelley, over to you.
Thanks, Rajiv, and hi everybody, and thanks so much for having me today. So before I start, let me tell you a little bit about SAVCA. So we are the Southern African Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, and our members are about 170 strong. We're about 20 years old, and those members are essentially split into about 120, which are full members, being the venture capital and the private equity fund managers, and then the associate members being the advisory firms into our industry, and those tend to be the law firms, the accounting firms, etc. So in terms of the projects I'm going to be talking about today, we focus when we come in these projects in terms of actually looking at it from our membership and the access to capital. So really we're looking at it from the venture capital perspective and essentially increasing the access to capital to the venture capital industry and therefore into the underlying entrepreneurs that they can invest into. So the first one to mention is the Startup Act. And I guess following the likes of Tunisia and Senegal, most African countries, or just a lot of African countries, are now looking into their own forms of startup acts to really shine a spotlight onto what this act can do and how it can promote innovation in the respective country, and really to increase the capital flows into entrepreneurs and startup businesses, both from a local perspective and an international perspective. We're going to be focusing on the South African one as a starting point. The other section is loop structures and intellectual property. Now, when we talk about loop structures and intellectual property, really what the main concern here is that really when you look at a scale-up, when they want to raise international capital, which is really, really important because often in the local jurisdictions, the capital just doesn't exist, and also access to international markets. In South Africa, where there's exchange control restrictions, this becomes a problem. And really what we're trying to do is just make it easier for entrepreneurs to raise this international capital, which should give them a better opportunity to grow and scale internationally. And those are the two from me.
And what is your non-work related takeaway from being in isolation?
Yeah. My non-work takeaway. So when I used to get stressed, the first thing I would do is stop doing exercise. In lockdown, the only thing I've actually kept consistent is doing exercise, and it's actually been my sanity check. So coming out of lockdown, it's the one thing I won't give up going forward, because it's actually just helped me to gain perspective and give me that time to think about things from a different perspective. Otherwise, I think I would spend day, morning, noon, and night working.
Thanks very much, Shelley. Our next speaker is Eva Warigia, who is joining us from Nairobi. And Eva has been championing the East African economic development over 8 years now, with experience in management consulting, investor relations, strategic communication. She is currently the executive director for East Africa's largest association of private capital investors, which is the East Africa Venture Capital Association. and they represent over 100 firms with over $5 billion in assets under management. Eva is responsible for industry advocacy, market intelligence, and overall promotion of East Africa as a capital destination. Eva, karibu sana.
Oh, Santi, and good afternoon to everyone. So the East Africa Private Equity and Venture Capital, pretty much like SAVCA, are the PE and VC representative trade body for the industry. And we've been in existence for 7 years, so a bit younger than SAVCA. And our mandate covers not just Kenya or Nairobi, but we also look at Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda, so the greater East Africa. And like Ranjit said, we are tasked with promoting East Africa as a capital destination, which is a good, one of the things that informed our decision to be part of the AfricArena and this web series. So about what we're doing, in 2017, the EAVCA did a change in its strategy, and one of the outcomes that we wanted to focus on for the next 5 years was catalyzing early stage investment and promoting venture capital in East Africa. And to that space, we have so far developed a lot of member engagement and worked with a lot of local, I would call them, what are they called? Accelerators and hubs to try and understand what are the startup needs. Then based on that feedback, as well as the VC feedback, we then created a sector working group, venture capital or early stage financing sector working group, to help the EAVCA to channel its advocacy or policy activity, its research, and also all the trainings that we would carry in East Africa to create relevant content for the region. So to date, we have been actively looking at standardizing the templates that would be adopted for early stage investment in the region. And this again was based off members' feedback or industry feedback, that it was part of the reason it took so long to invest in early stage investment, or one of the reasons that they were a bit conservative in deploying capital, was that there was no single way of looking at deals. So, but if we could help them with that, and maybe it would shorten the time, reduce the cost associated with the investment, it would probably help in deploying more capital to the entrepreneur. So I'll stop there for now.
Great, thank you. And what's your key takeaway from lockdown? Oh,
I'm one of the people who've been baking banana bread nonstop. So when we started, I didn't know how to make banana bread. So I'm a banana bread champion now.
Wonderful. I'm glad you mentioned the focus on early stage investments, because when I look at both the name of your organization, which is the East Africa Venture Capital Association, as well as the Southern African Venture Capital Association, I think there's private equity and venture capital that's combined within these entities. And it's really, really great to see that there is now an increased focus on earlier stage and VC type activity that's come through in both of your introductions. And just as a reminder to everyone, that's really the focus of this discussion, which is how do we spur investment into early stage businesses across the continent. Finally, Julia Price, who has spent the earlier part of her career in financial services at RMB and FNB before building out alternative private equity and hedge funds for Ashburton Investments in South Africa. After spending time at Stanford Business School in Silicon Valley, where she studied tech entrepreneurship, Julia co-founded Linear Capital Partners and has been advising growth stage businesses on capital raising, which she also does for Endeavor South Africa on a consulting basis. Julia, welcome.
Thanks, Rajiv. Thanks, and welcome to everyone this afternoon. Perhaps just a quick word on Endeavor. Endeavor is a global organization. We do some really incredible work with growth stage entrepreneurs who are typically expanding into new geographies and are therefore needing to raise capital either from the seed stage all the way through SAFEs, different instruments, up until kind of Series C or D. And so we are actively involved in helping them to connect to the right sources of capital, to connect to the right sources of talent and new markets globally. It's a great pleasure of mine to lead the capital stream. We are building out an investor community, not only in South Africa, but also overseas. And we really see an opportunity to connect our local funders with opportunities to be financed and to co-invest with offshore funders. And so as part of the work that we do, we started to observe more and more frustration felt by companies and investors that have been faced with term sheets with very complex and often very varied terms to protect one side or the other. Typically we find founders are subject matter experts, but often don't have the same level of experience in things like valuations or legal terms or deal structuring. And so there are significant expectation gaps that form between management teams and investors. And closing those gaps takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of management resources. It can be incredibly distracting for teams that are trying to build out businesses. And it can also lead to investors walking away, not only in current rounds, but also in future rounds. And so as our role in the industry as Endeavour, we really saw a great opportunity and benefit to create standardized term sheet, starting off with the South African environment, but also then building out with the East Africa Venture Capital Association and SAVCA into East African countries and into Nigeria, and also then working with our Endeavour offices in those countries, really to reduce the friction that we're seeing in companies raising capital rounds. This friction is across the board. It's not unique to our continent, but in other markets, the playing fields have really been leveled through providing these kinds of industry endorsed term sheets to help founders understand the way that investors think, and to also guide sometimes earlier stage angels or VCs with the kinds of terms that are reasonable when dealing with earlier stage entrepreneurs. So this is a document that it's a working document. We've got VCs and industry experts testing it as we speak. We plan to launch it next month. And ultimately our aim here is to really see more capital attracted to the continent, which by the way, requires a lot of trust building with offshore funders, and thereby reducing friction in securing that capital into African companies. My learnings from lockdown. So one of the things that I reflect on often is how lockdown has both united and divided our society. And I don't know if everyone else feels that way, but as South Africans, and in many other countries, I'm sure the same, but we tend to rally together when we're faced with adversity. We stick to rules, we protect the vulnerable, but it's also been incredibly dividing because in a country like ours, the economic impact of a lockdown is very costly. And so while wanting to protect each other, really find ourselves quite divided. So it's got this uniting and dividing impact. It's not a unique observation, but it's something that I feel we are faced with as a society a lot more in lockdown.
Very true. Thank you very much, Julia. Before we start the discussion, I just want to remind those attending to please use the Q&A function on the webinar to send through any questions you have for our panelists this afternoon. You'll find a chat function there. Please try to use the Q&A so that we can consolidate all of those within the same area of the webinar. So firstly, to our panelists, let's be honest, when we talk about standardized documents, regulatory interventions, loop structures, it's not really the discussion that people expect to have at a tech startup event. They expect to hear about all of the sexy buzzwords, AI, blockchain, innovation. But I'm extremely glad that we've managed to gather all of you, because this is the most critical element in the ecosystem, because this is the enabling environment that allows that sort of innovation to thrive and facilitates investment more fluidly. So I'd love to start at the beginning in terms of early stage investments and how we go about categorizing them, because in order to look at what due diligence is required, what sort of term sheets are required, we need to sort of have an understanding of the evolution of early stage investment. And so the question to all of you is, firstly, should we be aiming to create that categorization of seed businesses, series A, B, C, D, later stage? And if so, whose role is that? Is that a regulatory body? Is it an umbrella organization such as SAVCA or EAVCA? Or is it the market to define that?
perhaps I can jump in on that one, Rajiv. So I do think that it is helpful to standardize some of these and categorize as far as we can. It's helpful to a point, and then it does become complex. So for instance, categorizing a seed investment in the US is a very different type of deal to a seed investment in South Africa. And so it's helpful in determining for investors and making very clear for investors where a deal and a company fits into their mandate. Because the risk of any ambiguity is that investors actually just walk away because they're not easily able to put it into a box and get it through an IC. So there are times when it is really helpful. I think term sheets is another one where it's helpful to standardize kind of 80% of the terms. We're not going to solve for all the complexity. In terms of standardizing things like valuations, because investors have such different risk appetites, mandates, investor protections, it can get very complex to try and fit that into one mold. Guiding principles, yes, we can standardize those, but essentially we don't want to clamp down on the way that investors particularly and founders see their businesses and box them too much. So I think it's helpful to a point, and then it can become actually unhelpful for the environment after that.
I think just to add on to what Julia said, what we're finding is actually, I guess, one in the Startup Act that we've seen with the other African countries, together with our engagements with the South African Reserve Bank, is when they consider what dispensations they will give to a specific company, they want to know what that company needs to look like. And even the debate internally within the ecosystem, it's very, very difficult to come up with what is that and how do you determine it? You know, number of years, whether it's revenue, whether it's, you know, are they profitable? Are they leveraging technology? You know, are they innovative? Again, all those things are part of what it, but to actually pinpoint an exact definition of what are these companies that we look to do is exceptionally difficult and very difficult to get agreement on. So I think it's helpful if you then use that as a starting point to be able to go to policymakers and regulators, because they can then try and get their head around what type of and how big is this animal that they are looking at in terms of the type of entity that they're going to give these dispensations for. When you ask for a blank check, it's pretty difficult to get it. If they can get their head around, okay, the check's going to cost me X million dollars because I've defined this entity like this, it's a lot easier to get them to budge. So as much as it's difficult and almost feels like we've steered clear of it for quite a long time because nobody's wanted to try and put it in a box, at some point I think we're going to have to come together to be able to work out what the type of entity we're looking at, what are those characteristics, so that we can actually be able to lay a policy foundation and a landscape that will then enable them to grow.
You probably saw me nodding furiously at Shelley's remarks, but it's because she and I share a lot of similar circumstances when it comes to policy advisory. So in Kenya, we have the Micro, Small and Medium Enterprise Act, MSME Act, which covers a whole myriad of businesses, both within the formal services and production sectors, as well as the informal artisan kind of sectors. And that's supposed to be the policy that should govern everyone within the ecosystem, including those you and I and pretty much most people in this call or webinar agree to as an early stage business. And there's a whole lot of confusion when it comes to some of the privileges the businesses should get. When you look at the realities of that act, it does not necessarily fit what I would call the formal enterprises, which is pretty much a lot of what the people on this webinar do. It's mostly targeted at the artisan kind of enterprise. And we had to bring that to the government's attention, that we appreciate that the bulk of the economy is probably in the blue collar kind of space, but we have a lot of emerging, innovative, early stage businesses that could benefit from certain privileges and allocations that you probably had lumped up over there. So again, that's the premise of why it's important for us and why we are actively trying to change that space.
Great. So if we look at what you've both discussed in your introductions, and that is looking to facilitate more capital flows to earlier stages and to really get more capital to innovation at this end of the spectrum relative to private equity. The question for you is around de-risking and the information asymmetries that exist. So we all know that it's difficult to ask investors to pour a lot of money into early stage businesses where there is just that information asymmetry. So how are you as umbrella bodies seeking to provide support in our ability as an ecosystem to de-risk those investments, to create a more sustainable pipeline of businesses for the later stage investors?
So I think in private investing, early stage all the way through to later stage, there is information asymmetry. It's just the nature of what it is. And I think the standardized things in terms of, due diligences, what type of information do you ask for, and how they go about that, I think will definitely help. I think specifically on the early stage, the problem essentially comes in is the risk appetite. So where that risk appetite hasn't actually existed, that's very, very difficult. And no amount of information is going to get you over that risk hurdle, if that makes sense, unless there's some form of risk sharing or a guarantee scheme. And really, there's only a certain amount of investors that actually are comfortable enough with assessing the risk and then taking the risk. And really what you're looking for is actually to encourage more people to, one, learn how to assess the risk, to be able to take those steps, as well as to actually be able to potentially say a government to come up and match the funding or create a first loss pool or something to be able to facilitate the amount, the asymmetry that you talk about, or just taking the risk in order to create more investment that will flow to early stage.
So for us, one of the things that we did earlier on when we set out the strategy to focus on early stage investing was to attempt in our own way to define what that is and what the challenges are, and conversely look at VC and some of the challenges they had writing smaller tickets. When a VC says they're doing around $1 to $2 million investment, at least for East Africa, when you do that for a company that's earning in local currency, that's a significant chunk of money. And not very many early stage companies in the definition of early stage that we held as businesses that are probably pre-revenue and that kind of category, not many of them would qualify for that. So we had to talk a lot to the LPs of the VC firms, because every time we engaged a VC firm, the consistent narrative was, well, these are the terms that are given by our LPs on the kind of broad the kind of businesses that we should look at, the kind of tickets. So again, it led us to go all the way upstream and talk to the owners of the capital and ask, surely we need to change the narrative or the definition of venture capital as applies to Africa. Just because if venture capital in its definition is to accelerate business and create pipeline for later stage investors, it does not make sense for us to apply nearly the same matrices that we do for growth or buyout PE, and we definitely need to start changing the agreements that you structure with VCs to allow them to do smaller tickets. Yeah, so that's part of the work that we've been doing.
Okay, great. Julia, on this topic of de-risking, as we know and as you've mentioned already, one of the key issues is the time it takes to conclude a deal. If we have a willing buyer and a willing seller, we know they want to do a deal with each other. We then get into this whole process of term sheets, going through legals, going through due diligence. And for a startup who often needs to move very quickly and who needs money very quickly, this can be very, very cumbersome and sometimes be to the detriment of their existence because it could just take too long. So can you walk us through some of the thinking that you've been doing around that standardization process, and just through some practical examples, explain some of the creases that can be ironed out through taking a standardized approach?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. So through Endeavour, we really see a strong correlation between successful capital raising at all stages and setting very clear expectations between the parties upfront. And this is typically done through simple, easy to understand term sheets. And of course, as I said earlier, we're not going to solve for all the complexities, but what we hope is that providing a benchmark document, whether it's for entrepreneurs who've never raised capital before or those who are raising another round with a new set of investors, we hope that this will level the playing field and provide the right level of detail in kind of a glossary form, commentary on the terms that are helpful to accept, and essentially to do a few things. Firstly, as you say, to assist founders to raise capital quickly, to also reduce the frustration on the other side of the table from investors who find themselves spending a lot of time educating founders on capital raising principles. We want to create suitable comfort to build trust with investors across the stages. And the third thing is really critical, and it speaks to the asymmetry of information. We want to help companies make the most out of their cap tables, not only for the round that they're raising, but also for future rounds. And so what we see in the earlier stages is that entrepreneurs are so desperate to get the capital into their bank accounts that they don't really count the cost of what some of the terms will do in their next round or the following couple of rounds. And clauses like practically things like conversion options or anti-dilution clauses can mean that in future rounds, ownership is diluted to such a high extent that founders really own very little of their companies as they progress through the capital raising roadmap. So what we really want to do is help, even in the earlier stages, companies and founders to think about where they're going to end up in the next couple of rounds and structure their term sheets accordingly. Now, it's a very complex thing to walk the line between preserving founder value and investor protections. But these two things need to be held in tension. And we really need to be thoughtful about protecting founders and the valuation of their companies, but also to not let them get stuck into clauses and investor protections that will result in huge dilution later on. I'm working with a company at the moment where we're really battling to do a raise for them in sort of a Series A or B because they've diluted so much that investors coming in don't see the incentives for the management team to build the business. And that is because of early misunderstandings, not calculating the cap table right, and diluting way too much in future rounds. Mm-hmm. So that is something that we hope to achieve with this term sheet, and we hope to create quicker capital raising and much more efficient, smarter capital raising for entrepreneurs across the stages.
Can't wait. Shelley and Eva, just moving on to the subject of IP, and Shelley, you briefly mentioned this in your introduction. I often speak to investors about portfolio companies, and they immediately ask where the company is domiciled and where does the IP reside. And this is a huge topic within the investment ecosystem. Can you break down to those listening why this is such a contentious point and what you're working on at SAVCA to ensure smoother transfer of IP? Because I think there's all of these theories around whether I should incorporate in South Africa or in Nigeria, in Kenya, and where does the IP lie? And it would be good to share some light on that relative to Delaware or UK or European registrations.
I think a lot of it has to do with when you're trying to raise international capital. If I'm about to invest in your business, the IP is essentially why I believe your business is valuable, okay? And if it's in a jurisdiction that I believe that you're not going to be able to transfer out or be able to earn royalties out of or essentially license that IP, that gives me cause to concern. So I need to understand what in each of those jurisdictions my rights in terms of that IP is. So in essence, I think it has a lot to do with capital raising. So why it tends to be a problem is that if in the likes of a European or a US venture capital firm, okay, their fund documents specifically state that they cannot invest into an entity that is not domiciled in their own jurisdiction, okay? So that's problem number one. I now have an African early stage startup, and I want to invest in them, but my documents say I can't. So what do? I create a holding company in that jurisdiction that then invests into the company where that underlying operating company is, if you want to call it that. But often what comes with that, okay, in the South African context, if you want your entrepreneurs to stay invested, okay, they have to exchange their shares in the operating company to the ones in the holding company and do essentially a share swap, okay? But that, from an exchange perspective, creates a loop structure because now you're taking your money out of the country, investing into a foreign jurisdiction to then come back in. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that the foreign funder would also prefer that IP to sit in that holding company or in a jurisdiction that they are comfortable with. And there are also then restrictions as to how you can transfer that IP, jumping through various hoops and getting the relative approvals to be able to do that. Again, as we mentioned earlier, that's time constraints and you're running out of runway if you are a startup. So if you're looking to get capital, you may have found a wonderful foreign investor that says, I think you're a wonderful business and I would like to invest in your company, but I can only do it if the structure looks like that. And to set up a structure that looks like that, you've now gone from, I don't know, a 1 to 2 month. I've seen ones that have taken longer than a year. And the reality is that you will definitely run out of money by that point, and that then jeopardizes the entire business for the fact that actually you haven't been able to jump through the hoops to be able to get the investor and the investee comfortable with what the proposal needs to look like. So what we're trying to do at SAVCA, specifically from a South African perspective, is best case scenario, you know, your transfer of IP in and out of the country should not be restricted. You know, the reality is, as long as it's for fair value, there should be just a reporting. And really it's the time that it takes and the expense, because you've got to go and ask a whole lot of lawyers to essentially take you through the process to get the approval. And really what we're just trying to do is take that friction cost and the time and the effort and the money out of it. So that's what we're trying to do on that side.
Yeah. So it's absolutely, as Shelley has said, for the case of East Africa, IP security, IP registration and why it's important is really dependent on the security of the law of the operating country and the investors' confidence in that country's legal infrastructure can protect them in case of any eventuality. And any country that seems to be more business focused, I'll take the example of Rwanda, they're very good at creating infrastructure that can attract investors. Then you may have an easier time to get your IP registered locally and to be able to attract capital at the same time. So one of the things we have had to do is educate the public space about the impact of the kinds of laws they structure and the ability to meet the investors somewhat halfway. To appreciate that even for some of those investors, they're dealing with public money from their respective countries, and they want the security of law. We have fought the current income tax law for the last 3 years for the exact reason. One is very pressing for an entrepreneur or a business owner, but it also can be very frustrating for an investor, and trying to create an environment where the two of them can coexist and look at the different assets and how to value those assets in country is the determinant as to whether the IP should be locally or internationally domiciled.
Great, thanks, Eva. And just in terms of the East African early stage activity, we had a question about how founders and entrepreneurs can connect with early stage investors in East Africa. Are you working on any initiatives that creates a more fluid line of communication between these two groups?
Right. So we have primarily not, at least not in the past, not focused so much on those, but once we started to be more deliberate around the early stage ecosystem, then we acknowledged that we needed to do more. So we had some sessions around SAVCA in Nairobi early in the year. I saw the question, I don't know if the person was able to attend. And that was our way of trying to connect with that ecosystem. The other thing that we're trying to do a lot more now is to use some of the EAVCA venture capitalist members to speak at different early stage forums, connecting through the accelerator and incubation hubs, and offering their time to sort of pass knowledge around building an investable case and such scenarios, just so that we can improve on the business preparedness of the enterprises coming on from the East African market. So I do acknowledge we have not done as much, but it's something we are trying to rectify going forward. And the person who asked the question can take my email after this, and I will add them to our information list where they can receive details on any upcoming EAVCA event henceforth.
Great, thank you, Eva. We are quickly running out of time. I want to ask about the concept of the Startup Act, and just to kind of close this loop on how things come together from a macro perspective. So Shelley, you mentioned it briefly, but if you could just share a bit more detail around the idea behind this and what we hope to get out of it as an ecosystem.
Okay, so the idea behind a Startup Act is essentially to promulgate a piece of legislation that, one, defines what these type of companies would look like, and really outlines what the pinch points are in the ecosystem that they struggle with. And really what it is it's terms of, you know, a safety net for, you know, things like you can leave your job for a year and come back to another job if it doesn't fail, to encourage more people to be innovative, to start their own business. And really what it splits into is really the entrepreneur. So what are the benefits for the entrepreneur? What are the benefits for the company itself? Things like it doesn't have to pay tax for a certain amount of years. And, you know, it gets specific assistance to be able to actually achieve its goals, really, and be able to let it scale and grow quickly and with the support that it actually needs. And then the other side of it is investors. So obviously to increase the capital flow. So the idea around the Startup Act is essentially to be able to shine a light on innovative companies that have a huge potential to create this economic growth and jobs, and really to be able to actually set the economic and the regulatory and the legal landscape that they are able to actually scale and do this quickly and with as little friction as possible from an ecosystem perspective. So the idea behind it is actually just setting the framework, because I almost feel that where in Africa the startups or the early stage businesses have done fantastically well, they've done it in spite of the legislation. They haven't done it because there's been a great environment for it. So the idea is that actually, if you create this environment, more businesses should have the opportunity to be able to scale and to create this economic impact by leveraging the technology that exists and really making a big difference in on the continent.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask for your concluding remarks, but as I do that, the one thing I always find when listening to people talk about policy and a more macro approach is to understand that link between discussion and turning that into execution and action. And so with that as a theme for your concluding remarks, can I start with Julia and just talk about within your area of standardization and ensuring that we are able to be more effective in that, to just talk about the execution and any concluding remarks you have.
Yeah, thanks, Rajiv. It's been a great session. Just a concluding remark is that overseas we see standardization work very well and incredibly successfully. The NVCA in the US has a bunch of term sheets if you're raising capital there. The Galleon project has done the same thing for Europe. We know that Y Combinator has been a thought leader on safe agreements. And there's really a need for us, to your point, to execute benchmark documents for African companies and any investors investing in Africa, and really to elevate the narrative of the work that we're doing overseas and in different geographies to attract more capital and to build that trust to get capital to flow onto the continent. The one caveat is that it is helpful for this kind of work to be done by a neutral party in the industry, which is why I think that Endeavour and AfricArena with SAVCA and EAVCA really work well, because we're not directly going to benefit from swinging this either way. So watch out for our launch, for the term sheets. It's coming soon, and really we would appreciate any feedback from anyone listening in, so that we can get the best outcome for the industry.
Thanks, Julia. Shelley?
I think from SAVCA's perspective, the execution actually is key. So for us, we also focused on private equity for a long time, even though you're right, venture capital is very much in our name. But for the last, I'd say 3 years or so, early stage investing has definitely become a priority. And the idea is once it gets elevated to the strategic objectives of the association itself, then it really gets the focus that it needs. So the way our execution works in terms of an annual one, the Startup Act and IP and exchange controls are on our strategic objectives for the year. And we sort of don't start on executing on our strategic objectives until our conference is finished in February. So I guess we were relatively lucky that we managed to have it just before lockdown, and essentially that all came into being. So the reality is this is exactly what's going to hopefully be executed on between now and the end of the year. And I think the reality is you can execute for so long, but often with policy, it's the timing that makes such a difference, and really that willingness of the policymakers to fit in what their economic objectives are, or what their political and policy objectives are. And it's if nothing else, a good crisis like COVID, or never waste a good crisis. But the idea is that actually, you know, the economic structure as it stands at the moment, they really need to think about what they're going to do and how they're going to start growth again. So really, I think the policymakers across the world are really looking for what can you actually do to be able to do that. And something like a Startup Act or something to promote growth and innovation is something that they would hopefully be open to going forward.
Great. And the last word from Kenya.
Great. So for us, like I began by saying, early stage funding is one of the key pillars of our operations, effective 2017 and going into the medium term. And so we've invested quite a bit in trying to appreciate what are the needs of that market. I indicated we spent quite a bit talking to all the stakeholders, from the LPs to the VCs, and even the people who support the startups and the entrepreneurs. And we feel like we have a handle now as to the needs of the ecosystem. And so the next phase is now the implementation phase, working with partners like AfricArena and Endeavor to create the standardized Africa-wide accepted templates, and using those. Of course, we'll have to localize them to suit the East Africa perspective, but to, at the very least, to use this as the reference point for the industry, so that we can hasten the process of investment. And then beyond that, also talking to policymakers. And for me, the biggest battle on that side of the public sector has been to clarify that there's a difference between the informal startup, informal entrepreneur, and those of us who are working in a more service tech industry, and that our needs equally matter as much as those people do, and creating some allocations for that ecosystem as well, that the current ecosystem that we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
So that's also an ongoing piece of work for the EAVCA. It's also been halted a bit as priorities of the state shift to address the immediate concerns. But the positive thing is, or at least has come from COVID, is the need for the state to create more enabling environment for self-employment. And this whole narrative about the African youth is currently under focus. And so we're hoping to leverage on that kind of goodwill from the state to seek more interventions that would apply to the entrepreneurs and the tech ecosystem and everyone who's working to build using innovation and the future.
Fantastic.
So Rajiv, sorry about that, but I told people I'd put my email up. Somehow my typing, it went. So
there we go.
I had struggled.
Got it.
I really couldn't send it, but I put it up. And thank you everyone for indulging us to share our perspectives.
Fantastic. Eva, Shelley, Julia, thank you so much for your time. This was fantastic. And we hope to engage with you further.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rajiv.
Thanks. Speaking of execution and speaking of action, we're now turning our attention toward those exciting startups who are doing fantastic things across the continent. So I'm going to hand over to Leo to facilitate the virtual pitches.
Thank you very much, Raji. Thank you for all the panelists for your insights. So here we are arriving in the last part of our session. It's quite easy. We have 3 innovative ideas that will be pitched by 3 amazing entrepreneurs. So the proceeding would be as follows. The entrepreneurs will pitch for 4 minutes, and then it will be followed by 2 minutes of question and answers. So while the entrepreneurs will be pitching, we are inviting panelists and attendees to write their questions in the chat, and I will then read them to our entrepreneurs during the 2-minute session that follows the pitch. Quick overview, we will start with Ropa Fazo Musver, who is the CEO of Kweza, a last mile distribution service for inventory and digital services to informal retailers in South Africa. We will then hear Sajitu, co-founder of the Morocco-based startup Wigo. Wigo is a transport app for businesses that makes daily commute of their employees easy and affordable. We will conclude this pitching part with Elased Woodhouse. She is the co-founder and CCO of MV Exchange. Ella will be presenting their B2B maritime and freight logistics platform that aims to solve inefficiencies in vessel chartering, ocean freight booking, and trade finance processes. So from now, I'm going to ask Valentin to stop sharing your screen, and Ropa, you can then share your screen in order to display your pitch. As soon as you are ready to pitch, I will start the timer, and we will start. Be also sure, please, to switch your camera on. The other panelists, everyone is muted. Thank you very much. So Ropa, you can start sharing your screen now. Okay, great. So it's loading. Perfect. So whenever you are ready, Ropa, I will start the timer, and we start for the 4 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Leo, for the introduction. Well, good afternoon, everyone. This here, the first picture is Africa. 90% of all retail in Africa is informal. But let me bring it closer to home. This is being in South Africa, where 40% of all food spent in the economy is spent in the informal sector. This is valued at approximately 164 billion rand. That's huge. But the true worth of this market is not only in its monetary value. And let me show you why. In South Africa, at every single street corner in probably every township, you will find a spaza shop. Spazas provide 2 critical services. Firstly, they provide employment for the locals, but also they provide convenience to the community who no longer have to travel long distances in order to get their groceries and basics. This is all something we know is critical in curving and flattening the COVID-19 curve. But within this market, value for money is also quite critical. And this is because majority of this market is the lower LSM of the economy. However, informal traders like Sandile here often find themselves paying a premium for their products, which results in them eroding their margins. This is mainly due to 2 reasons. They have low buying power as they purchase alone, and they have limited visibility to the best pricing available in the market. At its core, our service provides and aggregates pricing at a wholesale level, ensuring that each time our customers buy from us, they are doing so at the best price, and ensuring that they save up to 10% on each order. We aim to provide visibility, convenience, and access. During this pandemic, our solution has been able to do more. In terms of convenience, because our spazas order via our mobile app and receive delivery directly to their stores within 24 hours, they are able to minimize travel. And in terms of access, we've been able to provide information about COVID-19, as well as provide supply of sanitizers, face masks, and shields to our spazas. But to really highlight the importance of the spaza shop in this pandemic, we have partnered with Flutterwave to provide food parcels to vulnerable families, and we are using our spaza shops as distribution points to all of the community close to them. That's impact. We currently charge a 2% commission on each and every order, as well as a delivery fee, but we're looking to incorporate additional revenue models such as promotional advertising, wholesale data analytics, as well as digital products. To this day, 280 times, our customers have said yes to our service, each time ordering an average basket of 4,800 rands, bringing our gross revenue in the last 7 months that we've done business to 920,000 rands. We've seen a monthly growth rate in our revenue despite the COVID challenges, and in April we grew 18%, and we're really excited to do more. But to achieve this, we need a passionate team of investors who see the value, the real value of the informal market, the people and its potential. And so we're asking for $450,000 over the next 12 months. This is for us to increase our customer base as well as expand our operations. And we intend to do so by building a team of brand ambassadors who will go out on our behalf, as well as digitize our payments and also include multilingual capability within our application. So why invest in us? Well, we're a passionate team, passionate about the growth of small business. We are an experienced team. We have experience in finance and payments, retail, logistics, supply chain, business and strategy. We have built several products and we are equipped to solve this challenge. So why not join us as we help informal traders digitize, formalize, and grow? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ropa. 4 minutes on the dot. Thank you very much. So I'm looking here. I don't see some question now on the chat, but I have questions for you.
Okay.
So South Africa is a specific market in the sense that the informal sector in South Africa, compared to other markets, I wrote down like Kenya, South Africa is very cash intensive. So how are you dealing with cash and its problems? I'm thinking, for example, a safety issue in the daily course of your operations.
Oh, thanks, Leo, for that question. That's actually quite important, and that's definitely something we're looking to work on over the next couple of months. So what we have done initially is we are leveraging on sort of behavior that we're already seeing in the market, where a lot of the informal traders will go and deposit cash into their banks for things like airtime. But we are also looking to see how we can leverage on other services that are available in the market, where we can take advantage of other infrastructure in the market. So whether it's service stations or pick and pay shops where these sponsors can also go and deposit. I think the issue of cash in South Africa specifically is actually quite a big challenge. Ideally, we would have used something like mobile money, which you've seen working everywhere else in Africa. So Robert, but yeah.
Robert, sorry, just to interrupt you quickly. There is, I think, an alarm in the background. I think it comes from you.
Oh, is it? Yeah, let me quickly check on that.
Yeah, I think it was your timer. If you can just, so I just quickly pause the timer for the Q&A. If you can just continue where you were, it was perfect. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh yeah, no worries. So I was saying, I think if we could leverage on something like mobile money, and I know MTN is doing some work trying to see how they can incorporate it, I think it would make a very big difference, because mobile money is something that's been proven to work across the continent. And I think it would definitely help in our space as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Ropa. So there's 1 minute left. I have a question from one of the attendees. So how are you dealing with the influx of competition arising from big retailer as they start to build mini convenience stores in townships?
So I think we have seen the emergence of, I think, people like ShopRite and Pick and Pay bringing in a lot of their trucks and everything. But I think, like I said, within the spaza economy, you have a spaza shop at nearly every single corner. These people have been established. A lot of them you'll hear will say they've been operating from those spaces over the last 10 years. So I think there is enough room in the market for players, and these players are already existing, right? They're already also competing with these bigger retailers.
Okay, thanks, Ropa. So it's 2 minutes. I can still see 3 other questions in the chat. So what we can do, I'm inviting the attendees just to put their email address, and maybe Ropa, you can drop them an email and just answer the question, or you can just tell that to me, and I will write an email to answer the attendees.
Absolutely. So thanks so much, Leo.
I will let you just unshare your screen. Sad is going to take over the screen. Perfect, Sad.
So hello, my name is Saad. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Wigo, and our mission in Wigo is reinventing daily commutes. Actually, in Africa, there is 400 million commuters in Africa each day. And in emerging countries, we use unreliable public transport to get to work every day. And it's really, really hard. So in order to solve this, we tried a first attempt that was a failure. We tried to help people with real-time arrivals for buses, trains, and metros, but it was a failed attempt. The reason is why, because there is three main reasons. The first one is that we found out that monetizing a B2C app in Africa was hard. We couldn't find a viable business model. The second thing is that we weren't solving the real problem. We were only applying cold water on a 3rd-degree burn, and it wasn't really helping. We found out that we can't give real-time arrival while the bus itself isn't available. And the third thing is that in Africa, there is, first of all, an infrastructure problem. And that's what Vusi said in the last AfricArena. And that's true. In Africa, for example, for the public transportation, there is a lot of lack in this side. And that's why we try to help that with providing affordable seats in buses for a large number of employees. And that's what we are doing now with what we call the READ solution, is helping corporates move their employees better. WeGo today manage, optimize, and provide shared end-to-end transport for businesses, schools, and public organizations. And companies partially or totally outsource the daily transportation of their employees, and we take care of everything. We are different than the current model of bus companies. While bus companies are route-based, dedicated, and have limited informations, we at WeGo Lines provide 100 seats for 100 employees company with no more costs. We share the bus with the companies that are in the same neighborhood, and that's why we have a flexible service and a much lower price with short routes. Our business model is simple and powerful. Companies pay $70 monthly subscription per seat per employee. Our product is based on three complementary apps. The first one is the platform, which is the operating system of all the transport that we manage. The second one is a driver app for our independent drivers. And the third thing is a passenger app for all the employees that get on board. Is there any traction? Yes, there is. We serve the largest employer here in Morocco. We're managing transportation for 17,000 employees for the biggest mining company. And right after the lockdown removal, we will be providing safe transportation with our buses for more than 6,000 people in the offshoring, the biggest offshoring park in Casablanca, Morocco. Last month, we just closed a seed round from the Moroccan Deposit Fund for around $300,000 for a $3 million valuation. What's cool about that is besides the investing, the Moroccan Deposit Fund owns the largest firm that manages the industrial parks here in Morocco. They are managing 18 industrial parks, and with that, WeGo will be the official shuttle service for those 18 industrial parks that are employing more than 200,000 employees.
So Sad, I'm sorry, I have to stop you here because it's a bit more than 4 minutes already, and just to keep it fair for the other ones.
It was the last slide. So I think we cracked the code. So if you want to help us do the same in South Africa, that would be really, really good.
Okay, so let's move on the question and answers. So again, I'm going to start with one of my questions that I've written, and let's see if there is more questions arising on the chat. Let me start the tune it now. Okay, so my question, Sad, for you is, can you tell me a bit more on how you're going to adapt, that's the elephant in the room, I'm sorry, but how are you going to adapt your service really to the new environment, to the COVID-19 environment, actually?
Yes, actually, we started doing that with the social distanciation. That is, you know, I'm a French speaker at natively. So we started doing that here in Morocco. For example, we are only allowing 50% in the same bus, 50% of the passengers. So it's really hard. But with the transporters, we try to find a way so we can keep this going, especially with imposing masks for all the passengers until this COVID-19 can just go after that, and we go to normal pace.
Okay, thanks, Sad. Another question. So another question from Andrew and Pekka. What kind of risk have you perceived, and how do you plan to scale? Sad, you have 30 seconds here.
Sorry, can you? I couldn't hear you.
What kind of risks are you perceiving, I guess, in the business, and how do you plan to scale?
For the risk, I think that the only risk that exists here is that if COVID-19 took a really long time before we get back to normal, and besides that, I think that it's much more easy for now to find much more available buses, because we use the touristic buses, so we can provide cheap, comfortable seats for the employees. And with this crisis, it's easier to onboard much more drivers that have their touristic buses in Ouigo, so we can serve much more people and then scale.
Okay, thanks, Sad. So we're a bit above even the 2 minutes. Thank you very much. Same as Ropa, I let you unshare your screen. And Ella said from Heavy Exchange, you can, so yeah, you're sharing your screen now, your camera is on. Same as Sad and Ropa, when you're ready, I'm ready.
Hi everyone, I'd like to sort of start by saying, or asking you a question about the device that you're listening to me on right now. How did it come to you? It probably came to you through a network of importers, in-country haulers and distributors to the shop where you bought it. And it's within that really exciting ecosystem which we as MV Exchange operate. Now, yes, I know trade volumes have been down because of the COVID crisis, but we found ways to innovate, such as focusing on in-country haulage and movement of essential items such as medical supplies to keep our traction going. But you ask, who are we? And we are a B2B maritime transportation and logistics aggregator with an integrated finance solution. And I'd like to highlight to you today one of our products, our latest product, MVX Transit. Now, we think it's a very simple product, but it operates in a really complex market. And that is, to take an example, say you're trying to move ginger processing equipment from Hamburg in Germany to Kaduna in Nigeria, and we're based in Nigeria. And you would probably have to do that journey to get the quotes and the price for the whole stage, contact multiple people who may not pick up the phone on time or be it via email. You don't know what the prices are, it's not transparent. And then once you've gone through many different people to try and get the best route and best price, you probably don't know where your shipment is on the route, and then it turns out they didn't handle customs for you. So you've got more opportunity costs lost there. And this is why we came up with MVX Transit, which is a one-stop solution to manage end-to-end delivery for import, export, and in-country haulage for African SMEs and people operating and selling goods into Africa. And we do that by simply managing the whole process for you. So if you're trying to move that ginger processing plant from Hamburg to Kaduna, all you have to do is log all the details on our platform and we handle everything for you. We let you know where you are at every stage of the journey. We get you the best price, show you the best route and give you options, and then give you real-time tracking and push notifications, as well as handling a whole load of extra services like customs advisory and brokerage to warehousing. And that's been exciting for us as we help businesses across Africa grow. But we've also been growing ourselves since we launched in the first month. Back in March was our first month, and we were offline, and we partnered with Kobo 360 for an order of 200 containers. And this comes on the back of a partnership with Kobo, which we had in our other maritime economy product. So then our second month, we went online and we received 5 orders in 2 days of launching. And then just the start of this week, in our third month, we got our first repeat order, which has been great. Now, as I said earlier, that's really exciting. What's been less exciting, but really interesting, has been adapting in light of COVID-19. So we've been hit by effective port closures, effective land and air border closures as well. And that means we've refocused our operations on in-country haulage, barging, road and rail, to capture the large internal market demand, as well as readiness services for when this trade thaw begins, as well as developing relationships with key industries like medical and food supplies to mean that we help move some of these key needs in the COVID situation. However, we're not simply just looking towards the moment, we're looking forward to the massive growth potential that we could have when trade starts to open again. And the total trade African volume is huge, as well as trade finance gap in the maritime economy. But moving on from that, I think one of the other things to do is to be able to capture that market is we need funding. We also need partners and clients. So if you're a business that's looking to do import, export, or move goods, please let us know, as well as obviously funders. So FYI to them, we're opening the second tranche of our seed round at the end of this month. And that money from the seed round, as well as the partnerships, will go to power our team. We've got 7 part-time and full-time maritime professionals, as well as our CTO, Toby, our founder and key CEO, Tonya, myself, and our CFO, Israel. So if you want to get in touch about any stage of our business and learn about what we're doing, please do get in touch. We'd lovely to hear from you. We're on founders@mvexchange.com. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Ella, for this speech. 4 minutes on the clock. I'm going to start again with one of my questions, and I will continue with the questions that pop up in the chat. My question is, so you guys are currently operating in Nigeria. So how scalable is the solution, in the sense that so the situation that you described is specific to Nigeria, but how could it be extended to other African markets? And also, what about outside the continent?
Yeah, sure. That's a really simple question. Often what we find in our market sometimes translates to port infrastructure, because ports, for example, globally find similar issues, but the solution that we've got for logistics, import, export, in-country haulage, is something that we can scale across Africa. And we've already got orders within other countries. And also we're able to facilitate orders from outside of Africa into Africa. So for example, we've had some requests to move things from Japan by a Japanese company into Nigeria. And yeah, so there's a huge amount of opportunity in the trade space. Okay,
thanks, Ella. I have a question here from Peter Muya, who is, looks like he's impressed by MVX Transit. So the question is, kindly clarify how you integrate with port operations like electronic single window systems to help importers manage cargo dwell time. You have 1 minute left.
Okay, sure. So we, at the moment, we operate through a network of partnerships. So the people who handle the customs processes are trusted partners of ours, which we've worked with before, and we work with them to essentially maximize that part of the delivery. However, we are always looking to integrate with new technologies and new initiatives, be that from E4M to the one that Peter mentioned. And that is something that's coming in our pipeline. We are quite young, but yeah, the aim is we work with partners to deliver customs who are using the breaking edge technology, as well as trying to look at for future opportunities for APIs within our platform.
Okay, thank you very much. There is another question that just arrived, but unfortunately we don't have enough time. So as I said to Ropa, maybe Ella, you can, or the attendees that just asked the questions, you can drop your email address and Ella would be able to answer. Otherwise, I will just ask Ella and I will drop you an email. So we can do like this. Thank you very much, Ella. So that was for the pitching part. I'm going to hand over again for the last time to Rajiv, who is going to give us some key facts and do the wrap up of this event. Your turn, Rajiv. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Leo, and congrats to all of those founders and startups who pitched. That was fantastic. I'd like to start by thanking our speakers and the startups who pitched throughout the series. It's been an incredible journey listening to your perspectives, and together with AfricArena, we embarked on this journey to seek answers to some really fundamental questions, and I think that we've been fortunate enough to have most of them answered, and that's come from founders, from investors, from LPs, entrepreneurs, and there's also been a lot of value that's come from those who've been listening. Some of those include some of the following. So, should startups expect to receive public sector support? We heard in the first session, not really. Are investors supporting pivoted models from their startups? And we heard from Enigma Ventures and PlaySense that is the case. Are equity investors continuing to invest despite travel restrictions and lockdowns? And we heard from Outlier Ventures and Standard Bank that the answer is yes, they continue to do so. And we've seen other examples in the market. Are LPs appreciative of the current investment constraints and building that into the expectations of the market? And we heard from the SASME Fund about their approach and the way they're supporting their fund managers. Are there alternative ways of raising capital without approaching equity VCs or traditional venture capital routes? And we heard from Venture Debt, Equilife Venture Debt, we heard from the Africa Crowdfunding Association that they are. So besides the current crisis, who's thinking about the more fundamental existential questions as far as African early stage investment goes? And today we've heard from SAVCA, from EAVCA, from Endeavor, and others in the ecosystem about all of the more long-term sustainable initiatives that are being worked on. But as we mentioned throughout the series, it's about catalyzing action, and more importantly, about catalyzing collective action. And it's in that spirit that we've seen the launch of various initiatives and online resources, which you're currently seeing on your screen right now. So for those founders who are looking to be connected with investors, there's the Eurocity platform, and you can find the link on the slide, and vice versa. Investors, angel investors, institutional investors who are looking for exciting investment opportunities to conversely do the same. You also see that there is a link to those interested in how the market has performed. AfricArena has put out a report not too long ago about the state of innovation across the continent. And for those who are looking to engage more, whether you are interested in building businesses and don't necessarily have one, but want to connect with like-minded individuals, FFA has launched or is in the process of launching the Hatch initiative, which aims to connect those within the ecosystem. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, it's really been a pleasure to co-host this series. Be well, stay connected, and let's collectively ensure that the African startup ecosystem doesn't just weather the current storm, but comes out even stronger and more supported by us. Thank you very much for your time.